He picked the bitterest corner of the family's land, a field everyone called dead for a reason, hard-pan crust, weeds like wire, and not a hint of green beyond scatterings of brittle grass. While other boys played along the river, he spent dawn to dusk walking the length of the field, tracing the longest cracks with his boot and marking quiet spots with an old stake. When he started to dig, the work was slow and stubborn. His shovel clanged against stone, earth so dry it broke apart in chunks, every hole a promise he refused to let go. Some neighbors slowed their tractors and gave a friendly wave, but their faces showed only confusion or a pitying smile. At the Saturday market, talk turned to the boy and his graveyard project, laughter easy and sharp as flint. But he kept at it, dirt under his fingernails and hope stitched in his silence, convinced that if anything could change this field, it might just be a little faith and 60 ordinary fruit trees. Every village has its cautionary tales, and his were polished smooth by years of repetition. In the warmth of kitchens, older brothers and uncles reminisced about the time old Mr. Petrov planted a dozen apple whips here, each one shriveled to bark by the second summer. Aunt Mina would shake her head, recalling how the school tried sunflowers in the dead ground, only to cart away a harvest of stunted stalks and blackened seed. At dusk, neighbors resting on porch rails swapped stories of sharecroppers who barely coaxed turnips from the dust, and of a traveling salesman promising miracle fertilizer that left only regrets behind. Sometimes voices dropped low, more regretful than mocking. His own father muttered about wasted seeds and tired money, the anxiety in his tone masked by a forced chuckle. Mothers at the bakery made bets, not unkindly, on how many weeks before the boy's first sapling would give up the ghost. Even the priest, passing by on his way to Sunday service, paused to warn him that sometimes faith isn't enough to change the shape of a place, no matter how much you want it. Yet beyond the warnings, the village watched with a curious itch. Why dig such holes in earth the elders had long surrendered? And as weeds bent and wind howled across the empty furrows, the boy's loneliness began to ripple outward, everyone wondering what kept him believing in what everyone else had let die. His first saplings arrived wrapped in burlap, roots bound, leaves trembling with promise. He planted them row by row, whispering as he worked. But the spring was stingy with rain. By June, the creek had slowed to a muddy trickle, and water, hauled in battered buckets, never seemed enough. New leaves blanched in the glare, edges crisping to brown even before the sun had set. Some days he dripped the last dregs from a canteen over a single root, praying for a cloud, hoping for a reprieve. Misfortune never traveled alone. One week, a stray goat squeezed through the rotten fence and chewed tender buds, undoing hours of care in a single afternoon. Another day brought a thunderstorm. Gusts tore up branches and snapped fragile trunks, leaving his careful rows battered and bare in the morning light. Each defeat took something from him, a little patience here, a measure of hope there, until worry threatened to swallow resolve whole. But sometimes hope fought through anyway. A solitary shoot, unbowed by wind, pushed new leaves after every setback. He found earthworms deep in the cracks, life underground, quietly at work. Though most trees struggled, the smallest patch showed a sprinkle of green after rain, a sign that not all roots were lost. Each evening, as the village passed judgment from their stoops, the boy ran his hands over the living trunks, telling himself that next season would bring more. Even when grit tasted like grief, a part of him listened for the quiet that comes before growing things begin again. With failure pressing close, the boy turned from stubborn repetition to quiet learning. He became a familiar sight at the feed shop's porch, listening from the edge as old men debated soil, rain, and seasons with the gravity of priests. From them, he learned to dig deeper holes, to let the roots search out the rarest shreds of moisture instead of crowding them in shallow beds. He borrowed an almanac from Mrs. Rodina 2 houses down, copying diagrams in a battered school notebook, sketches of windbreaks, tips to tuck young trees among sunflowers, beans, and clover to shelter them from wind and drought. He scavenged broken crockery from the dump, placing shards around each trunk to slow evaporation. At dusk, he watched wild birds and ants, tracing their winding paths to hidden pockets of dew by a mossy log, then used those lessons to shape tiny hollows and stone basins around new roots. Some efforts misfired. Beans that strangled more than they shielded, stakes that snapped in the night, mulch that washed away in a flash summer rain. Yet slowly, the orchard's silence began to change. Somewhere between despair and hope, patches of resilience took hold. Clover thickened at the base of the weakest trees, cooling their roots. One sapling, whose bark had been stripped by a wandering hare, sprouted stubborn green notches that refused to die back. On dusk walks, the boy pressed a palm to thin trunks, feeling a new pulse, a faint upward surge beneath the rough skin. No one passing by would have called it success, but more often, neighbors found themselves slowing beside the fence, noticing that the withering wasn't total, the cracks weren't quite so deep, and the oldest field in the village was not, after all, entirely quiet. Summer arrived fierce and unrelenting. Blight swept through the orchard, yellowing leaves and curling them to brittle paper in days. The drought that began in spring deepened, turning the creek bed to dust and the air to haze. Morning started with the sick weight of expectation. How many young trees would wilt today? Which ones would stand bare by nightfall? The village's laughter grew sharper as the field faded. From behind half-closed doors, neighbors shook their heads, and even his cousins stopped walking out to help, their encouragement hollowed by worry. At home, his family's patience thinned. In whispered conversations behind the stove, his mother wondered if it was time to let go, to stop wasting time and faith on land that would not return their love. The boy overheard, the words echoing his own fears. What if everyone was right? The saplings he'd named and watched struggled for survival, and each loss felt personal, a farewell to possibility. But on the darkest afternoon, his grandfather called him into the shade. The old man pressed a weathered photograph into the boy's hand, a picture of the same field, years before, stubbled and brown, with a single white-blossomed tree shining in the middle. "Hope takes its time," his grandfather said softly. "Sometimes whole seasons are lost before one branch bears fruit." The boy held that image late into the night, the memory kindling a stubborn ember. He promised himself, one more season, and no quitting with roots still in the ground. The next spring delivered a gentler kind of surprise. The rains came steady and soft, sweeping the dust from each furrow and filling every hollow he'd carefully shaped around the trunks. Where last year's blight had stolen color, this year the field was awash in green, first subtle, almost secret, then bolder by the week as fresh shoots unfurled along every row. Leaves thickened and gleamed after each downpour, the pale white blossoms appearing in clusters that held tight through every chilly night. On early mornings the orchard was alive with sound. Sparrows, robins, and blackbirds that hadn't visited for years circled the branches, singing over open blooms and hopping between rows to feast on beetles and moths. Honeybees traced golden lines from clover to flower and back again. The boy walked from tree to tree, not hurrying but tending each new cluster with patient hands, checking for pests, untangling branches, breathing in the scent of sap and promise. Slowly, the neighbors' attention shifted. The fence, once a border where gossip gathered, became a vantage for open curiosity. People paused on their way to markets, calling out greetings and tentative praise. Someone asked about the mulch, another about the hollows at every trunk. The storekeeper dropped off a tin of sharp shears and a bag of stale bread for the birds, while his cousins returned to help weed and water, their skepticism replaced by cautious pride. It was still fragile. One wild hailstorm, one pest outbreak, and hope could curl up again. But as the breeze sifted through a living, leafy canopy and pollinators hummed at his elbows, the boy realized a new story was taking root. The field, once the village's shame, was becoming a quiet marvel, changing even the old men's talk on the porch with every green bud. By late summer, branches bowed under the weight of fruit. Where once there had been only scraggly growth and failed dreams, 60 trees now blushed with apples, pears, plums, and more, spheres of red, gold, and violet dangling in clusters so heavy that neighbors walking past stopped short in disbelief. The word spread farther than a storm cloud. On market mornings, baskets of bright fruit appeared on doorsteps and by the church gate, each labeled simply, "For everyone." Children who'd once made jokes perched on fence rails to help pick. Elders who'd told stories of failure brought sackcloth to collect the bounty. The bakery's shelves overflowed with pies and jam. Even the local school replaced cafeteria apples with the orchard's sweet, sun-warmed ones. The village square, often quiet by harvest time, was filled with laughter and scents of spice and syrup, an ordinary field now at the center of community celebration. People sought the boy's advice, asking how he coaxed life from death. He answered humbly, sharing stories of old books, of listening to elders, of water saved and roots given patience. Standing in the dappled shade as the season waned, the boy watched the oldest villagers sample fruit and smile, their eyes bright with pride and something softer. For the first time, respect rounded every remark, no more jokes or side glances. Though his hands ached and his boots wore thin, he never looked prouder. Where others saw only failure, he had trusted the hidden power of persistence and hope. In that year's miracle harvest, the village found not just sweetness, but something sacred. The proof that faith and hard work, even in the hardest ground, could bring a whole community back to life. The orchard's story didn't end with a single harvest. New saplings appeared along fence lines and behind barns, planted by families inspired to try for themselves. Fields long considered barren now shimmered with the silver green of young leaves. The village's old doubts replaced by the quiet industry of digging, mulching, and watering. Hope passed from neighbor to neighbor like a precious seed, weaving through gardens and backyards in the laughter of children and the bright work of their parents. And though seasons still brought setbacks, each tree rooted in that soil carried the lesson forward. Sometimes, the ground that seems most lifeless hides the richest promise. Now, as baskets fill at dusk and neighbors gather under the branches, there's a better question left for all of us. What miracle could you start, simply by daring to plant where everyone else has given up?